Oh, okay, I just have a few more slides to talk about the Neolithic, especially proof of land use during that particular time. And what I want to do is just spend a few slides looking at soil erosion and the evidence for that. So there's lots of different places we could look. One major kind of erosion we see is when shorelines move. And this happens quite a bit when you compare the ancient world to now, where, for example, you've got two sites here. Let me get my pen going. Oh, let me try that again. Oh, right now it's not working. Anyway, you've got Nea Nicomedia, which is in Greece, and then I've got a little map here on where that is in Greece. That used to be on the sea, so right on the sea. And now it's about 30 kilometers inland. And what you have happening is that the rivers are bringing down soil. And you get what I put here on the slide, significant alluvial deposits. And part of that is from erosion from farming. Now, not all of it, but some of it certainly is. And Troy, the very famous Troy, that is another example where you've got a city that used to be right on the sea, on the Aegean Sea, and is now inland. Okay, I've got a stock photo here that is not Italy. In fact, I'm not quite sure where it is from because I pulled it off the Microsoft PowerPoint free images. But anyway, there are lots of studies on major erosion happening in Neolithic Italy after people start farming. So again, what they're looking at is water use, soil use, land use, and that when trees and things are dug up and moved and plants are put down, you get erosion. And you see more erosion the closer you get to having large communities and cities being built. You see the same type of evidence in France, in Neolithic France. And I've given you here the name of an article that's actually really good, talks about all the different data you can find on erosion during this particular period. There's more evidence for that from northeastern Spain. In this particular case, you can look at pollen counts. And in this area, at this particular site, you've got evidence of lots and lots of wood being cut down. So you've got over 1,000 posts that have been found, and these are posts that were clearly used to build houses and different buildings. And then what you also see is evidence of soil erosion, and that's obviously from cutting down so many trees. And then you can look at pollen counts, where the pollen counts of the particular trees that were cut down obviously get reduced because there's not as many trees left, and the pollen counts are much less. So you see erosion and soil use during this particular period as well. And then finally, my last example is from Majorca, which is an island in Spain. This particular data comes from the Bronze and Iron Age, where you have slightly larger populations. Now, if you look at the pollen count, you get decreased tree pollen or arboreal pollen. And that, of course, indicates cutting down of trees. And you get evidence of charcoals from wild olive trees. And what's really interesting is that if you look at the pollen counts, you get an increase in grasses. So what that indicates is that the trees are being cut down, the pollen levels for those trees go down. What comes up are grasses. Some of them are native grasses, some of them are like wheat and barley, but that pollen gets increased. So clearly the clearing out of the trees is allowing other things to grow up in the same place. And about the same time when you get all this evidence, no big surprise, people on the island are starting to build much larger buildings. And as I put here, it's showing an organization of society. So they're growing more food, they're clearing more land, and so on. And you get a collapse of the society around 2800 before present. So about 800 BC. You still have pollen evidence and you still have charcoal evidence. So people didn't die off in this particular area. They stayed, at least some of them stayed after their society collapsed, and then they rebuilt. Okay, you also see, in terms of land evidence, the creation of terracing. And you've probably seen places that have terraces. I have a nice slide here in just a second showing a beautiful picture of terraces. But essentially what a terrace is you've got a hill, which, as you can imagine, you get lots of rain and things coming down, especially if you pulled out the trees. And so what people have done in the past is they built these things called risers and treads, and then this is where the soil sits. And so you can grow plants and things in this particular area, and that's a terrace. And then further down the hill, you would have another terrace. And so these are built to for a variety of reasons, protecting the soil, keeping the soil in a certain spot, preserving water, because again, without the terrace, the water would just come sliding down the hill, causing erosion and causing lots of issues, and you certainly wouldn't be able to plant too much. And then possibly crop management. So again, this is sort of a beautiful picture showing some of the terracing, but you'd be able to grow a lot more in this particular area with all of this increased land area done by terracing. Now, there are some issues with looking at evidence, especially erosion evidence. And as I put here, increased rainfall in areas where you normally wouldn't get rain can certainly lead to more agriculture, which then leads to more erosion. It's sort of a cycle that sort of makes sense, but you can also see the opposite would be true. If you're getting a decrease in rainfall, that could lead to less agriculture, which can lead to a decrease in erosion. So just because you see a decrease in erosion doesn't necessarily mean that there is more agriculture. So there's lots of other things. That's why looking at pollen counts, looking at charcoal, and other different types of archaeology can really help with figure out what is going on in terms of land use. And then a big question is, did they understand what they were doing to their environment in the Neolithic period? And I wish I had an answer to that. When you look at various studies, you do see people changing some of their tactics, their house types change, or they move to different areas. We talked about that in a lecture before, where farmers in the Middle East had particularly a dry period with the 8200 before present event, and then they moved into parts of Europe. But when you're thinking about a question like that, just remember the limitation of our sources, which are primarily archaeology. Again, there's no writing from this period, so we don't have something from somebody to tell us what happened. You look at charcoal, you look at pollen, you look at soil use, and so on. Now, when you think about, do they understand what they're doing in the environment, you could look at that in a different way. Did they understand how to preserve and help the land that they were growing on? So in ancient Greece, at least according to this particular study by Weiberg, they were using manure for fertilizer, and there's lots of studies done on manure use and how you measure that and so on. So they knew that putting animal manure on the land would make it more fertile. It also appears that in ancient Greece, and this is the case in some other areas too, that they would follow a cycle, which is where they left fields fallow, meaning they wouldn't plant in a certain year or a certain time. So maybe one year they'd plant wheat, the next year they wouldn't plant anything there, and maybe they'd put animal manure down or not, but that's what it means to be fallow. So they understood that what they were growing, if they grew material in the same area, your crop yields would go down. So leaving it fallow and putting manure would actually make your crop increase go up. Now they also used terracing, and that really helped. So they seemed to understand what erosion was, and at least they understood that if they built terraces, they could grow more food. And then another example during the Neolithic is from Cthulhuoc, and we talked about this in a previous lecture, just really briefly. They actually moved to a nearby site when there were things happening. And in this case, it's not quite the same as what we're talking about, but there was a climactic event, which was the 8200 before present event, and they actually moved to a different area. So now they weren't doing that to their environment, but the environment was doing it to them, and they reacted by moving to a better spot. But anyway, it's really important to think about this as you're reading through the sources, reading through the journal articles. You know, what do we think that they understood what they were doing? Now, in the civilizations we're going to be looking at, like Egypt, Rome, Greece, the Mayans, and the Aztecs, we may not totally know if they absolutely understood what they were doing to their environment, but at least we have writing. And so next week we will start looking at specific civilizations.